Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we have Red Eye History, and tonight we're talking about the man who has an unhealthy interest in trees. Now I'll hand this over to MC, and hopefully he knows what he's talking about because I'm pretty damn sure I don't.
I don't think that he had an unhealthy interest in trees.
Right. Number of things I know about this man. He chopped down a tree, and there was an axe involved, and he went across a river. And he won the war. Okay, I've now listed everything I know about the man. Okay.
All right. Okay, George Washington. Okay, George Washington is a very quintessential American in many ways, in certain regards. Okay, he is the his parents come from the, for lack of a better term, the aristocracy, right? As it applies in the United States. He is not in the upper echelons of this because for one thing, he's not the firstborn. He's the youngest. All right. And as basically the youngest, when you're the youngest son, all your brothers, they get the lion's, quote unquote, lion's share of everything.
Yeah.
But as a youngster, he was typical of that age. And unfortunately, right, when he turns 11, all right, the ideas of things that he's going to follow in the footsteps of his brother ends rapidly because his father dies. And of course, when your father dies and everything is dispensed in your inheritance, you being the least, you end up with the least amount, right? This does not mean he was destitute. He was never really destitute. Okay. But he is taken in, right? Basically by a more well-known aristocratic group called the Fairfaxes. And the Fairfaxes are basically the ones that raise him from 11 years old on, right? But he's not able to get formal education. The education he gets is somewhat ad hoc. It's an education that he himself has to delve into to personally, try to aspire to, right? Yeah. And one of the things that he decides that he wants to get involved in, of course, is that everyone knows is surveying, right? And so he basically, throughout his life, they estimate that he surveyed over 60,000 acres of land. Right. So he surveys all sorts of things around the country, right? As he expands, he is part of the survey group that goes out, which basically causes him to enlist, right, and be accepted as a member of Braddock's command, right, right prior to the French and Indian War, right. It is a disputed territory in the West, right. Washington makes things worse.
Oh, that you mean that minor incident with the French? It's hardly even worth mentioning.
Well, I mean, the thing is that he goes to confront a French outpost that he has been informed is in their area, and the English are disputing this area as English territory versus French territory, right? Now, hindsight being 2020 and everyone looking at things from 10,000 years and not 10,000 years, but 10,000 foot and years and decades and centuries later, there are people that the general consensus, and this is still just a general consensus, not everyone agrees with, was that the French claim was superior to the English claim, right? But of course, the one thing that's always been true. All right, is possession is 9/10 the law. All right, so he contests this. There is a firefight. In the firefight, a a Virginian is killed. Several French people are killed, including someone who claims to have diplomatic immunity, right? But they're supposed to be a diplomat on a diplomatic mission, right? So Washington is accused of basically killing a diplomat, a person under the flag of diplomatic truce.
Yeah. And
Right.
Falcon, don't blame us for this. This was the French accusing you this time, not us. It's strange to think we're actually innocent. And by the way, killing the French is never a bad idea. Well,
Good morning, Miss Murder, or afternoon. I'm sorry. At which point, the French and Indian War. It's often considered the beginning of the French and Indian War, but the reality is the French and Indian War is going to happen anyway. Right? It's just like with one of those things where you have contested areas, multiple contested areas. All it was looking for was a spark. Okay, Washington helped provide that spark. He is part of the first command to try with Braddock. Right, when Braddock is attacked and goes on the attack and goes on the offensive. In that attack, where Braddock is mortally wounded, every single officer, with the exception of George Washington, is wounded. During that battle, George Washington has 2 horses shot out from under him, and his coat is pierced with bullets 4 times, but he never received a wound.
in England, we call this a lucky bugger.
All right. He carries the wounded Braddock back. All right. Braddock dies later. And this is the start of his quote unquote military career. Okay. Braddock was very much enamored and very impressed with Washington and gave him glowing recommendations. All right. Washington himself was an athletic individual. He was tall. He was big, right? Especially for that time frame. People don't realize this. Back in that time frame, if you were over 6 foot, you were a giant. Okay, you were a massive individual compared to what most people were. Even today, right? I'm 5'6.5", close to 5'7", right? Depending upon which record you want to look at and whether or not I had a good sleep the night before, right? I would have been considered tall back in those days because most people were around 5 foot, right? Human beings were much shorter back then, and the reason for that is food. Okay, one of the things that we learned is that the reason people generally are short is they don't get enough food as youngsters, and so their bodies don't develop as fully as they could, right? This is one of the reasons why in China you don't have as many tall people, but they're growing. They're growing rapidly. Why? Because they're starting to get food. They're starting to get enough of the food resource. But at the time, George Washington was 6'2". Okay, the man was a virtual giant. He was a hell of a dancer. Now, this is interesting because George Washington, as a youngster, always wanted. He how do I put this? Like I said, he was a member of the lower aristocracy. Right? He wasn't someone whose life didn't have tragedy all around him. Right. So, but at the same time, he wasn't. Yes, you would be extraordinarily tall, Ms. Murder. In fact, you would be a giant for a woman. All right. Back in those days, 5'6", you would be giant for a woman. You'd be towering ahead of people. Back in those days, most women were on 5. If they were 5.
Every minute of that, by the way. I'm just trying to suggest that perhaps you was born in the wrong century. Maybe you want to consider going back to, I don't know, about 1200. You never know. You'll finally be taller than someone.
It was quite a bit different back then. Now, George Washington's half brother is someone he greatly admired, and throughout his life he thought of him and the gentleman who took him in, the Fairfaxes, all right, he looked at them as the epitome of being a gentleman. And at 14 years old, he wrote a book. Now, this is obviously before he got involved in the French and Indian War, but he wrote a book or 10 Rules of Civility, right? And I've got those here. Let me share my screen here. I'm going to read the first 10 because they're enlightening for a variety of reasons. First of all, every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. In other words, if you're doing something in public, recognize that there are people around you and think about how they are viewing this. Don't do things that would disrespect them. Okay. Obviously, in today's society, with the internet, with Twitter, with everything else, that's pretty much a bygone kind of era. Okay. When in company, do not put your hands or any part of the body not usually discovered. Now, what does this mean? Well, obviously it means don't scratch your balls in public. Okay. But it also means don't stick your hands under your, don't put your hands under your armpits. Don't scratch your ass, right? Basically, when they say you're not usually discovered, okay, don't leave your hands in your pockets. Simple things like this. These are things that he is considering. Remember, part of civil life, he is talking about how an individual should comport themselves. Not that they have to, but this is how they should. Okay? Shew nothing to your friend that may affront him. Okay? Or affright him. Don't sit up there and say something that your friends may take out of context or they will make them mad at you. Right? These three here show you why he's going to become the person that he is. In the presence of others, sing and not to yourself. Don't drum your fingers or your feet. If you cough, sneeze, sigh, or yawn, do it not with loud but privately. Speak in your yawning. Speak not in your yawning, but to your handkerchief or your hand, or hold it and turn your side. So if I want to yawn, I should go again. And they shouldn't yawn in front of people. Right?
Yeah.
Now, that one may have had more to do with his teeth, and we're going to talk about teeth in a minute. Sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Speak not when you should hold your peace. Now, that one's, I'll be honest, that one's out the window when it comes to me. And walk not on when others stop. In other words, don't stick out. This is an admonition of himself, right? Not to stick out in general words, right? If society has rules, obey the society's rules. That's what this is, right? Now, as a young man at 14, you can understand this, right? Once you become older, it becomes a little bit different. But at 14 years old, he's basically, child should be seen and not heard, and the less seen, the better kind of mentality that's going on. Do not off your clothes in the presence of others, nor go out of your chamber half-dressed. In other words, dress before you leave. Don't sit up there and take off a shirt in front of others. All right? This is don't dress down. Okay? At play and at fire, it's good manners to give place to the last comer. The last comer, right? In other words, accept everybody to play. Don't leave somebody out, right? Affect not to speak louder than ordinary. Don't yell while you're playing games and doing things. Show some reserve. How often do you see that today? Anywhere? spit not in the fire, nor stoop low before it, neither put your hands into the flames to warm them, nor set your feet upon the fire, especially if there be meat before it. That one's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
When you sit down, keep your feet firm and even, without putting them one over another or crossing them. Okay. Now these are just these are the first 10 of this 110, and I wanted to read them because they show a different era. You know what I mean? It's a different it's a different way of life than what we're used to. But it shows you what you are supposed to be like in company, right? In society, in polite society. I always thought that line for women were for women. Women are to be seen, not heard, unless seen the better or less. No, it was children. There are people who said it about women, I'm sure, but I think it was children. It was children. That's where the line comes from.
To be honest, I was always told children, so yeah.
It shows you the attitudes of what he admired, right? What he was eschewing to. It shows you that he himself was someone who appreciated being taciturn, right? Someone who was not going to be outwardly. He was not the outward speaker. He was not the Patrick Henry. He was not the firebrand. He was not the John Adams or the Thomas Jefferson. He was never going to be one of those people. Okay? He was someone who was going to be quiet. He was going to reserve his right to say things. He would do things as he saw them, but overall, it was his goal to always get along. Right? In some ways, he was very, very much of the mentality, right, in a different manner though than Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was hardly taciturn. Okay. Now, you mentioned about the tree, right, in the myth, the cherry tree, right, where George Washington chops that cherry tree with an axe. And his father asked him, "Did you chop down the cherry tree?" I cannot lie, Father. I did chop down the cherry tree. We don't know, all right, how much of that. We believe it's all a myth. We don't know. All right. But why is it an issue to chop down a cherry tree? Do you understand why it was an issue?
Honestly, no. I mean, apart from the obvious of, it was like the family cherry tree or something like that. But I'm assuming it's because he really, really didn't like hippies.
No. The thing is cherries are not native to North America.
Oh, okay. Didn't know that.
Cherries come from Asia.
Okay.
So cherry trees, any cherry tree that was planted was something that came over and was transplanted, so they were extraordinarily rare.
Yeah.
Now they grow. They obviously grow in America, and there are now cherry trees that line the Washington Mall. The Washington Mall being the big area in front of the Capitol building, which has a Washington monument, and all the other monuments are close by, right? For those who don't know what the mall is. And those cherry trees were actually given to us from the Japanese.
Okay, didn't know that. Good to know.
Yeah. It was a gift by the Japanese. I don't know if it was the Japanese emperor who gave it to us, or if it was the Japanese ambassador at the time gave it to us. But the cherries were not necessarily initially indigenous to America. So if you chop down a cherry tree, right? He who hippies on my property will be taken down. All right. So chopping down a cherry tree would be like, this is a rare thing that was growing, and look what you've done, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Who would do such a thing? Fruit trees, things like that. I mean, there are trees. Obviously, there are fruit trees in America that are ubiquitous, right? But there's trees around America, for example, apples, right, that are spread across America because, quite frankly, people were running around like Johnny Appleseed, literally planting apple trees everywhere. Right? He was not the only person, and so forth. But groves of trees, stands of trees, and fruit trees, and everything. These were a commodity that on a plantation were vital to, obviously the running of the plantation. They were vital to the plantation's independence, right? Self-sufficiency, right? And back then, self-sufficiency was the word, right? So that's where all that comes from. Now, of course, it's told to school kids, or at least it used to be told to school kids, to impress upon people, even when you do something wrong, don't lie about it, right? So it became, this came from George Washington, the founding father, and you should hold him in high regard, which, of course, in today's society, none of them hold him in high regard, even though they should. So, let's get back now. See, during the French and Indian War, all right, George Washington serves with distinction. Now, once again, one of the reasons that he is picked up by Braddock initially, right, wasn't just because he's got the name George Washington. Right? It was because he had been a surveyor through a lot of this territory, so knew this territory very well. And like I said, the fact that when Braddock's command got shot up, the fact that George Washington was able to take command, right, and at least turn it, at least prevent the rout from becoming an absolute disaster. Because a lot of people are like, okay, it was a retreat rather than a rout. No, if you look at it, it was pretty much a rout. But George Washington did organize it so it didn't turn into an absolute disaster. I'll give them that. Right. And of course, this becomes, one of his, defining moments. He's now a known quantity, all right, within the Virginia politics. Okay. So when the First Continental Congress is called, he is selected as one of the statesmen. Right. Now, in his early life, all right, he's a young man. All right. And when in his teen, he has an, for lack of a better term, infatuation with a woman who becomes the wife of his best friend. You're going to say something about this, Jensen.
Yes. You get to hear all these wonderful things about dear old Georgie boy, but nobody mentions the fact that, to put it bluntly, the guy had the hots for someone else's wife. Is it me, or does this somehow seem a little bit off? Then again, I suppose it's the sort of thing that went on in that sort of timeline.
Well, it's impossible to know. All right, to say that he had a crush on this woman. All right, at the very least, all right, is an accurate statement. Okay. This is one of the people, though, for lack of a better term, this was one of his teachers. This is one of the people that taught him social etiquette. Okay. So you could look at it if you want to look at it from in modern vulgarity, it says, hot for teacher. Right. She was part of the family that took him in. All right. She basically was with him in more or less in many ways as a teenage. She being a teen, he being a preteen. All right.
It had to be done.
They were not the souls of his enemies.
It's true. They're not the souls of his enemies. It's the souls of his friends. Sorry. Cough, cough.
We will talk about George Washington's teeth in a little bit. A little memes. But no, he did have it. He did have an infatuation with her. He did write, which for the time were flirtatious, basically flirtatious letters to her. Okay, there's no evidence that he actually had that it ever went beyond, just a correspondence, right? Or anything. The best way I can describe it is there are a lot of people who have read versions now, have read documents back in the day of Richard II and Philip the Fair. And for those who don't know, Richard II is also known as Richard the Lionhearted, right? Now, Richard the Lionhearted, all right, and Philip the Fair were respectively the kings of England and the kings of France. And there are many accounts and so forth of them sharing a bed, right? Modern day people have said, oh, they must have been flaming homosexuals. Okay. No. Back in those days, all right, sharing a bed was not uncommon with people that you knew. And the reference to sharing a bed in those days often had a different connotation, meaning they were sharing the bed and any partners who came with them, i.e., women, right? Chambermaids, etc. But back then, when it was a cold night and you wanted to sleep next to somebody, you needed another body there. You were doing, but it was nothing sexual about it necessarily. And people have misunderstood this to think that basically Richard II was a homosexual. There's no evidence of that. Okay, it's a modern view of what happened back then. It's a modern take on things that happened in the past that may not have any kind of relevancy, because that's not what it meant. That's not what they were talking about. Because if they did think that Richard II was a homosexual, they'd have killed him. Yeah. His father would have killed him, for crying out loud. King Henry.
Sorry, dude, but quite simply, he would not have got the throne. There would have been a cough accident, or they'd have dragged him out and hacked his head off in front of people, depending on what was needed. After all, of its time, that was illegal. In fact, it was illegal and immoral. Yeah. So not only would he be executed, but he would be executed, and the execution would be cheered on.
Especially in the fight for the throne, where basically he came out on top. Do you think that he would have been that would have been tolerated if it was actually homosexual? I'm not decrying homosexuality. I'm just trying to point out that people are trying to put something into history that didn't exist. All right, and that's where you end up with a lot of this. They say there are letters, all right, for example, between Benjamin Franklin and several French courtiers, for lack of a better term, female members in good standing at the court. Let's leave it at that, right? And if you read them, all right, they will give you the impression that they are lovers, all right? That there's an affair going on there, but there's no. When you really research it, there's no real evidence to that. And knowing the kind of nature of Benjamin Franklin, he would do things like this just to have fun with people. Not saying he didn't cheat on his wife. Not saying he didn't have affairs, because there are affairs that were documented from Benjamin Franklin. But in the specific case that I'm talking about, there's no evidence that he ever actually slept with the woman that most people think of as having this torrid love affair with. There's literally no evidence. right? Mainly because, quite frankly, there was very little time and very little era and ability, all right, for them to actually be in the same place at the same time to actually engage in such an activity, right? Well, the same thing applies here to with George Washington and Fairfax, right? And she does marry, who is a guy who's at the time, one of his best friends. But it's hard to say whether or not it was more than, like I said, just an infatuation, just a schoolboy style infatuation of hot for teacher. I wish you were, my lover, Jesse's girl, right? That kind of context.
Yeah.
So that's not saying that George Washington was a perfect person and never slept around. There are other indications that he may have had affairs, right? But who knows? Right? And he ends up in an arranged marriage with Martha Custis. Now, you made a statement about who George Washington married earlier.
He says innocently, yeah.
All right. Martha Washington, most people know very little about. And quite frankly, she would have liked it that way.
Yeah.
She herself was in many ways, was personality-wise, was exactly like George, right? Quiet, all right? I don't want to say demure because that's not the right connotation, right? She was a reserved individual. Okay. She was friendly by all accounts, but not flirtatious. Okay. She was highly intelligent. And her marrying George was not her first husband. George was not her first husband. Her first husband had died. She was a widower. Okay, when she married George.
Yeah.
So in some ways, she was George's teacher. She was George's best friend and quiet support from the back. And because of the nature of the man, it is impossible to know just how much they loved one another. All right. It's undoubtedly just because from all accounts they must have. All right. But they both yearned for the same thing and rarely found themselves with what they wanted, which was a quiet home life of, where they could just live in quiet certitude with all their finances and everything all being taken care of, and just live the the life of a genteel farm owner, or plantation owner, where they just sat back, did what they needed to on the farm, puttered around their days in quiet leisure, for lack of a better term, where they didn't have to put out, they didn't have to, everything was going to be okay. Things would more or less run themselves, and they can indulge, all right, in their, in their hobbies, which were pretty modest. They were modest people. Okay. Now George, like in his early life, of course, was also a member of someone who was, people tried to ascribe to him to being extraordinarily religious and then non-religious at the same time. And the reason for it is because, his family, especially his mother, tried to teach him morality through Christ and through the Bible. George, on the other hand, decided to learn morality through the books of that talked about gentility and how to behave in society. His morality had a different flavor to it. That's what I mean about a man in his time and out of his time. Okay, it's impossible to understand what kind of a religious outlook George Washington had. He was as likely to stand there, and make sure that he was the usher at the church and everything, and then just as likely not to take communion because he left early. All right. I mean, this sounds kind of weird. There were times when he openly told people, especially during his presidency, that that one of the best things you can do is go to church. But at times he would miss church for weeks and weeks at a time. Okay. He doesn't talk about.
Sorry, sir, but I want to point out that time going to church was actually a big thing.
Yeah.
The idea of if you missed a weekend of church, it was actually discussed. It was, oh, we didn't see so and so at church. Oh, I wonder what was wrong with them. It was notable.
Yes. Now, Martha, of course, was a dutiful churchgoer. She would attend church services, regularly, right? So it was kind of, well, where's George? Well, George is off doing this. George is off doing that. That's just the way it was, right? It was a different. If you look at his writings and everything, while he does talk constantly about providence, right? Talks about God from that standpoint. You don't see him, often referring to Christ, right? Or Christianity in general. So from that aspect, that of the man, that's another aspect of the man. Now, as the revolution, because this is supposed to be more about the revolution anyway, we should probably talk about the revolution.
If I may, just one moment. Mm-hmm. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, I found out something quite interesting today. It appears Martha's Vineyard is not, and I repeat, not connected to Martha Washington, which surprised the living daylights out of me. I genuinely thought it was.
No. Martha's Vineyard is actually a reference to several, appears to be a reference to several aristocrats from Britain back in the day. That has absolutely nothing to do with George Washington.
Okay, well, I just thought it was right for me to tell everyone, because after all, if I thought it, it's quite possible other people might have thought it as well.
Now, the Custuses, Martha Custis, is that side of that family, right, has a lot of American ties, to include ties to Robert E. Lee, right, which is obviously the Confederate general for the South. All right, so just to let you know, the Custis name was an important name in Virginia. It remained so for centuries. Okay. When George married Martha, right, like I said, he was much younger than she was. Right, it was not her first marriage, so in a lot of ways, she was the one that was teaching George. Right, she was the one who was the family. And what's more is her family, her side of the family, her things, they were far more well off than George was. All right. You can say that George married up in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, you can say that, although George's family itself was not poor, right? His half-brother and so forth were extraordinarily, wealthy and so forth. Now, did George own slaves? Yes.
Oh, you're going, yeah.
Okay. George Washington purchased a slave. One of the slaves that he purchased was a gentleman named Harry Lee. And he purchased Harry Lee for 61 pounds, right? Which back in the day, that was quite a sum. Okay. But he purchased him as a quote unquote, household servant. Well, Henry Lee was much more than a household servant. Henry Lee, was and became basically his how do I put this? wherever George was, Henry Lee was. Right? Throughout the Civil War, throughout the campaign, Henry Lee was with him. Right? Henry Lee was his boon companion for the rest of his life. Right? George Washington eventually does free Henry Lee, and Henry Lee stays with George Washington even after he frees him on Mount Vernon. All right. When people saw Henry Lee, that saw George Washington, they also saw Henry Lee, and he became as well known at the time for the people, right? Because both of them were considered. In fact, Washington at one time said this. He said that when somebody commented that he was the best horseman, and George Washington was an extraordinary horseman, right? He loved riding horses, all right? He was one of the best riders in the American public, but he often said that he was not the best, that is, Henry Lee was. Now, Henry Lee was with him in the campaigns, in the battles, everything down the line, okay? But once again, the ideas between in slavery and what we know of slavery today, all right, is overly colored with the worst aspects of slavery. And there's nothing, and I'm not saying that any aspect of slavery was wonderful. Don't misunderstand me, okay? Because none of it was wonderful. But we only ever focus on the absolute worst aspects of it, all right? But that's not really the way the world worked back then. And when George grew up, all right, his view on slavery was perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. As the revolution takes place, all right, he actually issues an order, right, to avoid ever having blacks or African Americans, right, serve in the units, right, in the Continental Congress or in the Continental Army. And then, of course, it quickly retracts this, okay? All right, because the other members of his group, basically, as the revolution goes on, convince him of the wrongness of slavery, right? And it's an evolution over time, right? And after he overturns his order, of course, for example, one of the regiments from the first Rhode Island regiment, right, had 225 men, 160 of which were African Americans, right? Who they were issued, then they were promised their freedom in Rhode Island, they were promised their freedom if they served in the Continental Army, and they served with distinction. The first Rhode Island regiment served with distinction. And so you're seeing these African Americans fighting. You're seeing them fight, and how well they fought. Right? The British did the same thing. The British stood there and promised freedom to any black slave that joined the British. And at the end of the war, in fact, over 3,000 of them are basically, taken by the British to Nova Scotia, right, to avoid having to be turned over to their former masters and so forth. All right, but that's a discussion for a different time. So, slavery is one of the issues that impinges upon George Washington for his entire life. Now, it's true that George Washington, all right, upon his deathbed, he frees all of his slaves, right? However, okay, there's a couple of things, and there's a couple of caveats with that, one of which was that they would attend his wife until she died. All right. The second thing, of course, is while George Washington himself owned a number of slaves, he didn't own the slaves that were part of his household from Martha. And even worse, Martha couldn't free her own slaves. And in fact, one of Martha's young maids, that's the word I'm looking for, right? Actually, during the time period during George's presidency, refuses to return to Virginia and actually flees to New Hampshire, right? And refuses to go back to Washington, even though Washington makes overtures to her to come back, return to servitude, return to slave servitude. He actually thinks that it's going to sound kind of crazy, but he actually believes that she's been seduced away from the Washingtons by a Frenchman. Right. Right. And so that it would during when one of the people finds her that George Washington sends to try and bring her back, she tells him, no, there's no Frenchman involved. I wasn't seduced by anyway. I want my freedom. And the big thing that she was worried about, right, was Martha. When Martha died, because Martha, according to the laws and the rules at the time, Martha couldn't free her slaves. That when Martha died, she was going to be given over, basically deeded to one of the daughters, one of Martha's daughters, whom was known for her quote unquote fiery temper. And she was like, I am not going to be the slave of that woman. Can't say it's a blame her.
It's understandable, isn't it?
You can't say that's not understandable. All right, the fact that she was free and everything. Now, what's interesting, and this is pointed out years later, right? People are doing stories, and a guy is doing a story with this woman. She's doing an interview with in 1848. Sex slaves. There were there were a number. Sexual liaisons at that time frame were quite common. All right. In fact, the woman, the slave that I'm talking about, who ran away, her name was Ona or Oni. I think that's how it's pronounced. Oney, Oni, right? Oni. How else you want to say it? I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. She's actually the daughter of one of the Custer's slaves, and a a Frenchman who was visiting. Okay, so who had been visiting for a couple of years. So, yeah, the idea of sexual liaisons, the BS French don't look good at all. We're not going to go into that. They're fucking. She's talking though, and like I said, she's being interviewed, and it's pointed out to her. The interviewer points out to her, right? Look at your life. Look at how you live today, right? It sucks. If you were the household slave, you'd be so much better off. Which she's like, yeah, but I'm free. She's like, I wouldn't trade it for anything, right? She marries a freed black man. She has two daughters, which unfortunately she outlives. Right, so she outlives her husband as well, right? Who's a black sailor. It's just one of those things, right? But it shows you the inducement and the power that you have to be free and so forth. And it's something that while George Washington realizes this is a problem, okay, that slavery is a problem, he doesn't know how to handle it, right? He becomes very he has the idea. His first idea is okay. In order for me to free all the slaves, to include the slaves that are Mary Custis's, right? What he has to do is he has to figure out a way to get money so he can basically buy them, and then if they're under him, is he's purchased them away from the Custises, right? Then he owns them and he has the authority to free them. right? He never is successful at this campaign. He never gets this kind of money, and the reason for it is, quite frankly, is whether you like it or not, right? And we're talking reality. Back in those days, slaves were not cheap.
No.
Okay, the idea that slaves were sold like barley wheat. Okay, it's not how it was. That's not how it went. If you owned a slave, you were extraordinarily wealthy. If you owned more than one slave, you were in the top 1% of society. That's how expensive slaves were. It's how expensive they were to maintain, right? I mean, think about it. You are now responsible for the health and welfare for another human being. Now, most people look, yeah, they were just beaten and they were used like trash. They were not disposable commodities because you would just lose money by doing that. So you had to take care of your slaves to a large extent. That's not saying the brutality of slavery didn't exist. I'm not going to deny that. Like I said, there's nothing good necessarily about slavery. All right. But the ideas of the world in which they lived and how all that came about is alien today to us because we don't see it. We're not a part of it. We didn't grow up with it. All right. We grew up in an entire different era. Washington grew up when that era was ubiquitous. All right. Turned from it. And yet he himself couldn't figure out a way to do this. But he did understand one thing. He did understand that he himself was a precedent setter. Okay. That people followed what he did. And he had the belief that if he freed the slaves upon his death, that it would become commonplace. It would become the standard that other slave owners and the rest of the Virginians would then follow. Right. And of course that didn't happen. Right. Sorry to say that didn't happen. Right. It would have been nice if that did happen, actually. Because Washington did set a lot of trends. Now, the First Continental Congress is called. George Washington is one of the people who's attending it. He's one of the delegates, right? He goes there, and when they start discussing who's going to lead the Continental Army, right, in the Second Continental Congress, George Washington is showing up every day in uniform. In his uniform that he wore during the French and Indian War. Now, you have to understand something, okay? As people are talking about who's going to lead the Continental Army, everyone knows that this is a plum assignment, right? It is and it isn't, but everyone knows. Everyone wants to be the great leader, right? One of the people who really wanted the job is someone that most people know by name, all right, but don't even think about from the American Revolution because he's not very well studied, right? And that's John Hancock. Okay, John Hancock really wanted the position. Okay, John Adams basically says and talks John Hancock out of it, and for good reason. John Hancock is a unique individual, politically very astute. He is a smuggler. Okay, he is a rambunctious individual. Okay, he is intelligent. All right, he's braggadocious though, and he's also a Bostonian. And John Hancock is wise enough to realize that who they pick can't be from New England. And the reason for that, his biggest concern, and rightly so, was that if you pick somebody from Boston, if you pick somebody from New England or New York, right, that the Southerners, the Southern colonists, right, from South Carolina, North Carolina, and so forth, that they, Virginia, they would not look upon the Revolutionary War as including them. That's a New England thing. It's a New England problem. Let them deal with it, right? They want to join the revolution, right? So as you look around, then, well, who else you're going to pick? Okay, and as you go around, the only one, as you start looking around Congress, all right, the people can trust, because he's quiet, he's always there, he's a steadying influence. It's George Washington sitting there every day with his uniform. And so John Adams basically nominates George Washington. George Washington is acclaimed the leader of the Continental Army. He gets up, decries that he wanted the role and saying, I never wanted this position. Right? And he never said he did. You can honestly say that he never said he did. Okay. And he feels unequal to the tasks that has been that's been given to him, but he'll basically do his utmost to carry it out. And so he goes and goes up north to take control of the Continental Army. And the first thing he finds when he gets to the Continental Army is, what the hell is this?
I'm going to enjoy this bit.
He looks around, and basically what he's seeing isn't an army, it's a gaggle of various thugs and reprobates and gang members. is how he's looking at this, going, what the hell? They're a bunch of ragtag pieces of flotsam, for lack of a better word, right? That don't know how to act. They don't have any kind of uniformity. They have no kind of training. They have no kind of respect. All right, they're as likely to fight with other members of the unit than they are with the British. Right? They're not a military force. And in fact, one of the first things that George Washington has to do is write the manuals for proper attire and digging of latrines to prevent basically what's going to turn into a scourge, like cholera outbreak that'll wipe out his entire force. Right? He basically has to start writing that on his own, go in there and basically define how to lay out a camp, how to sit up there and where to build latrines and how the latrines should be built. All right. How where these people should be. Okay.
If I may for a moment, it would have been good if he'd run out of ink. That's all I'm saying. Or at least it would from my side.
Now, the British at this point, all right, they're basically surrounded in Boston. When one of the people who's going to become his good aide, Knox, right, travels to Fort Ticonderoga and brings back the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, and puts them in place around the city of Boston. The British realize, okay, we can't stay here. Okay, so they basically leave, and they temporarily go north to Nova Scotia. All right, they come back, all right, and capture New York, which everyone kind of figured they were going to do it. But when the British came back down from Nova Scotia, they came with, this is not an exaggeration, right? Hundreds of ships. Okay. This is, they didn't come, all right, with a platoon. They came with tens of thousands of men and hundreds upon hundreds of ships. Okay.
We were just saying hello.
All right. This is at a time frame. Yeah, you can say sailing ships. This is the age of the sailing ship, but hundreds of ships. I don't think people can even grasp just what that had to look like, right? What that must have been like in a harbor that probably saw 10 ships, a day going in and out, most of which were local ships, right? You may get 2 sailing ships that would come in from somewhere, during the week or whatever, and then float back out. And now all of a sudden you're seeing hundreds of ships, to include ships of the line. These are big ships. These have a lot of force.
Yeah.
Now, why am I bringing this up? Because we kind of covered this already a little bit earlier. But the reason is because I don't think people have an understanding of what that meant. I think it was the first time that many people in America understood the true depth of power of the British Empire. Okay. What it was actually capable of doing if it so desired. And even then, they did this. They dropped, for all intents and purposes, the fleet dropped Howe off. I think it was Howe. And left, more or less. Okay. They didn't totally leave, but, obviously they had other things to do, right? Most of the ships did, right? But they still left a sizable British fleet there. Now, George Washington is now outmanned, flat out. All right. And what's more is he's outgeneraled. Now, I think that statement, though, belies something. All right. There's a lot of people that decry George Washington's tactical capabilities. Okay. I there's reasons that they say it. There's reasons that they talk about it. But the reality is, there's certain things about George Washington that is kind of a weakness, but at the same time, you got to understand who the man is, because he was a man of his time and what he grew up with. George Washington's experience in the military is that the military was with the British military, was with the British forces, right? He has expectations that his own men will act like the British soldiers, but they're not trained like the British soldiers, right? And this is something I don't think that George Washington really did a good idea about it. They were not as trained. They were not as capable, whether you like it or not, as the British soldiers. Secondly, right, he had no formal training. Once again, George Washington basically learned to be a surveyor. He kind of went to school and kind of didn't, all right? But he became a surveyor on his own, right? That doesn't mean that you understand the military. You haven't studied military tactics. You haven't studied, military maneuvers, all right, as they existed at that time, because he's never been in those kind of situations, right? So the expectations behind George Washington in the fights, George Washington is often surprised because he gets flanked, but it's not because to say that he was surprised that he gets flanked really is more because he lacks something that he always took for granted, and that is intelligence. Okay, and I mean this. The one thing that Washington ran a hell of a spy ring. Okay, in many ways he was a consummate spy master, not a consummate spy, but a consummate spy master. Knowing how to set up organizations to spy on the enemy, to constantly delivering him intelligence. And the tactical intelligence, though, is not the same thing as strategic intelligence. Knowing where the enemy generally is or going, or what their plans are for the future, are one thing. Knowing what the enemy is doing right now is something entirely different. Okay, and understanding how the military can function and so forth, entire different manner. And so a lot of the early battles in New York, where basically Howe forces George Washington in retreat after retreat and escape after escape. And those escapes in many ways were masterful. Absolutely masterful. People really don't give George Washington a lot of credit for that. And they really were. And I'll talk about one of them in a minute. All right. But George Washington's retreats, all right, are as tactically brilliant, all right, as his ignorance, right, when the battles that in the skirmishes and the battles that he loses. All right. The ability to maneuver forces, the fact that you are undermanned, all right, doesn't change certain things, however. And this is what people don't understand. And, like, for example, in New York. Does George Washington know that he has fewer troops than the British? Yeah. Well, then why does he split his forces to try and protect all these different areas? Right. Because he had to. Okay. There were expectations there. This is what people don't understand. There were expectations laid on him. He had to be there to fight. He had to be there to show. George Washington wasn't stupid. He knew he could get outflanked. All right. He would just do what he could with what he had because he had to do it. He didn't have the option, for example, of going, okay, we don't have the troops to stand against the British in New York. I'll just let New York fall. He didn't have that option. If he'd have done that, all right, he'd have been accused of cowardice. All right. His army would have dissolved underneath him. He had to do it. There are times when you've got to do things that you got to fight, even a losing battle, even if it's a fight, a withdrawing type of battle, even if it's going to cost you men. All right. Because the situation, if you don't, will lead to something worse. And we don't recognize that today. So a lot of these, decriers today talk about, George Washington was horrible at tactics. I'm not saying he was a tactically brilliant individual. Okay. I'm just saying he wasn't a bad tactician. It's just that he didn't have the forces to do what he needed to do. And the situation forced certain things upon him that he didn't, all right, and couldn't react to the way he would have loved to react to. And as his men would fall back, he would reorganize what was starting as a rout and turn it into a retreat, and he would retreat. So to be able to do that and keep that army together is absolutely masterful, and it's really underrated, and it's part of the tactical tactician of the man as well, because he understands the totality. He can't lose the entire army. That's one thing he understood. He can't lose the entire army. During his greatest, the one that everyone talks about from George Washington is his crossing of the Delaware, right? Masterful stroke, saved the Revolution. It did. Okay, leads to the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton. Okay, but we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Wasn't that done by a different president?
That is a statement by. We choose to do these things not because they're easy, but because they are difficult. That is something of a quote from JFK.
Yeah.
All right. So.
And say what you like about JFK, I don't think he was around during Washington's time.
No. George John F. Kennedy was not around during George's time, but George Washington crosses the Delaware. Everybody knows about this, right? During that crossing, all right, which takes much longer than he wanted. All right, he surprises the Hessian garrison at Trenton, routs them under Colonel Raoul, defeats them, captures a load of supplies, right, and a series of arms, right. Now the British are surprised, but they're not stupid. Okay. They react. People think that the British, they just were in camp. Well, when that happened, of course, General Cornwallis, reacted with over 8,000 men, right? Close to 3 times the size of the American forces, right? And actually sets up thinking he has Washington pinned, right? And he reacted, Cornwallis reacted very quickly. Okay. Washington, of course, right, during another one of his night escapes, makes it look like the Americans are camping in this one area, right? And they keep the fires burning all night and everything. And he slips off so that he can attack Princeton, right? And so he begins the Battle of Princeton, right? Where he's also successful. And in the Battle of Princeton, all right, his men show true fortitude, right? Because what happens is Cornwallis is not ignorant. He has sent a group, a force under, I'm trying to think of the guy's name. What's the guy's name? Under Mawhood, Mawhood, right? To basically try to reinforce Princeton. The two forces, all right, one of the things that Washington learns, of course, is that he wants to blow up a bridge before the British can cross it, so that he can take Princeton. Right. That small force that he sent to go do this, under part of Greene's division, right, gets spotted by Mawhood, and Mawhood begins to attack and gets across the river, attacks. The Americans are forced back and repulsed in their first counterattack until the rest of Washington's force arrives. And Washington, once again, they're getting ready to flee, and Washington holds them by force of personality. In fact, he's riding up front. He is less than 30 yards from the front lines of the British. Okay, and it's actually, when the British attacked, they thought they'd already killed Washington because there was an American commander who basically said, I think his name is Mercer. Mercer goes, when they tell him to surrender, he says, hell no, and he fights to the last and is finally bayoneted to death. And unlike the rest of the American forces, he's dressed in uniform, and so they thought that Mercer was Washington. They thought they'd killed him. But Washington is less than 30 yards away when he rides back, keeps them in line to hold for the rest of the American forces to arrive, at which point they overwhelm Mawhood. Mawhood attempts to retreat back to Princeton and basically is surrounded, and the building that he is in and his forces are basically cannoned into submission. Okay. But it was all predicated on the earlier movement and the earlier escape by George Washington. Okay. So George Washington was not tactically, inferior in and of itself, right? It's the fact is you can look tactically inferior, all right, when you don't have enough forces to fight, right? Yeah. And at the same time, you have to. There are expectations that you stand. Okay, a lot of people are like, "Well, he could have done guerrilla tactics." Yeah, to a point, yeah, but he had to stand in the field, because if he didn't, it was not going to be tolerated, right? You couldn't keep the population behind it and everything, right? The war obviously drags on. Washington goes through another series of defeats that are well known, right? And then of course you have Valley Forge, right? And the winter of Valley Forge. And it's the second winter of Valley Forge where an individual arrives. A German individual, all right, who we know as Baron von Steuben. Okay. And many of the American aides were very dubious of von Steuben. Okay. But von Steuben brings with him, all right, something that Washington has realized the American troops are lacking, and that is discipline, right? And it's von Steuben, who goes about writing the manuals, all right, for drill and ceremony. That we even to this day, most of the drill and ceremony that we do in the American Armed Forces today come from the manuals of drill and ceremony by Baron von Steuben. And Baron von Steuben changes the Americans at Valley Forge from a guerrilla kind of army, right, to a true professional fighting force. And at Fort Monmouth, they prove it. At the Battle of Fort Monmouth, even though it's considered, most people consider it a draw, the British consider it a kind of a victory, although it's somewhat Pyrrhic. But the American troops don't run. They are forced to retreat, but they retreat in order. It is not a rout. It's not a running battle. All right, as it goes into it, they retreat in order, and this is after they fought all day long. They just eventually were outnumbered. It is what it is. All right. If you ever read about the Battle of Fort Monmouth, it was a horrible conditions to fight in. And once again, there's Washington at the front of all this. So eventually this leads to, of course, the Battle of Yorktown. Now, at the Battle of Yorktown, one of the things is coordination is finally achieved between the French Navy, okay, and the American military, where they had been looking to. One of the things that Washington and everybody recognized was that while the British had control of the sea, right, it was impossible to force the issue. Now, Cornwallis had set on a campaign that was devised to conquer and basically subdue the southern colonies and take them away and kick them out of the support for the Revolutionary War. Right? And it doesn't go well. Okay. It doesn't go well because, quite frankly, the Americans are constantly in a guerrilla warfare mode and campaign. All right. And it is turned into, for lack of a better term, a civil war between the loyalists and so forth. There's a lot of atrocities committed. Cornwallis is aghast at how some of the things that the people technically under his command do, but at the same time, you have to go through this stuff, right? He is met with on the battlefield. He is trying to chase down a large American contingent that is sent down under Harry Morgan, right? Under Morgan. Morgan leads Cornwallis on a chase all over the Carolinas. All right. I mean, all over, always one step ahead. All right. So it's a constant chase. And it's during this chase that Cornwallis he realizes the Americans have freedom of movement that he doesn't have. So he attempts to say, okay, I'm going to dump all my baggage. I'm going to dump the logistics chain, right? I'm just going to ignore it, and I'm just going to go chase after this guy. Well, that's great, but what do you do when you run out of logistics?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Cornwallis, it was a risk, but Cornwallis at this point, all right, because of trying, you can't just go there, leave a small garrison, walk away, go there, leave a small leave a small garrison from place to place, right? Because the garrisons get attacked. Okay, so you're getting defeated in detail, right? And of course Cornwallis understands this. Cornwallis understands they can't he can't afford that, right? He orders a number of campaigns. He has a battle at Cowpens, which is the big battle, okay, which basically forces him to more or less retreat, and he ends up at Yorktown. And it's at Yorktown that the opportunity comes together. The French come in and defeat the British fleet. It is a hell of a battle. But the British were caught off guard, all right? And quite frankly, what happens when you don't do anything for a long period of time is you get sloppy, right? When you're not training well and you kind of just, okay, we're just waddling around here for month after month after month, you don't maintain your sharpness. This is a problem with what they call garrison troops, right?
Yeah.
And so the British fleet was not at its best, but and as a result, they get defeated. The French fleet holds. The British try to put together a counterattack fleet. They do a lot of damage to the French, but they are unable to force the French to flee. At which point now, Cornwallis has no way out. Okay, George Washington has moved his entire army into Virginia from where Howe thought he was, close to New York. Marches them all the way down, and they basically surround Cornwallis and effectively force the surrender. And it's the surrender of Cornwallis that leads to, all right, the treaties and so forth that becomes the Treaty of Paris in 1780. Right. Now, but it's after Cornwallis is defeated, the British basically are stuck in a real fight with the French, because the French have declared war, I believe, at that point. Correct?
Yeah.
And so they're not, the American issue is that's them over there. That's a sidelight issue. George Washington keeps his troops in the field because until peace is declared, all right, you can't trust it. Okay. The American government's put together under the quote-unquote Articles of Confederation. George Washington is then impressed upon in, I think it's 1782 or 83. I think it's 82, right, by his officers to reform the army and march on Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress is. And the reason for this is because these soldiers are waiting to be paid. They've been promised to be paid by the government, and they haven't been. And what's more is they're also owed a pension, okay, from the Congress, and the Congress isn't doing this. And so there is serious talk, and I mean serious talk, amongst the generals, right, that are under George Washington to basically force Congress to give them what's their due. It's basically a military putsch, right? Military coup. And they're discussing this. They're discussing this seriously. And they come to George Washington because George Washington is the great leader. George Washington is the man who beat the British. George Washington is the man who's not. Right? And George Washington basically tells them no. 1783. Right. And he goes, I have a letter I've prepared. And then he goes, he starts the letter and he says, excuse me, gentlemen, my eyes aren't what they used to be. Right. And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a pair of spectacles, a pair of glasses. Right. and his men. These are the generals. These are his aides that are proposing a coup, right? You know, they're looking at this. One of George Washington himself has no sons. He has no hereditary offspring, but he basically adopted one of Mary Custer's sons, right? And he has died, right, in the Revolutionary War, right? And he puts on the spectacles and he goes, by anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, how subversive of all order and discipline. Let the good sense of the army decide. In a moment of this summons, another anonymous production was sent into the circulation, addressed more to the feelings and passions than to the reason and judgment of the army. The author of this piece is entitled to much credit for the goodness of his pen, and I wish he had as much credit for the rectitude of his heart as for the men, those different optics are indeed induced by reflecting faculties of the mind to use different means to attain the same end. The author of the address should have had more charity than with the mark of suspicion, the man who should recommend moderation and longer forbearance. In other words, who should not think as he thinks and act as he advises, but he had another plan in view, in which candor and liberality of sentiment, regard to justice, and love of country have no part. He was right to insinuate the darkest suspicions to the effect of blackest designs. Right? Basically, he calls out his men and dresses them down. This could have very well turned into a coup. Okay? And it was put down simply because George Washington said, we're not doing this. You're not doing this. All right? The man's force of personality was something that I don't think anyone today has any understanding of. Okay? The Articles of Confederation, of course, fail. And so they convene a convention with the idea of revising the Articles of Confederation. Right? And what is interesting is during this, what you end up with is the U.S. Constitution being rewritten. They basically scrap the Articles of Confederation. Instead of revising them, they totally throw them out. Right. This is something Mad Dodge was always railed against. They didn't have the authority to do that. They were supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation, not rewrite the whole thing. The Articles of Confederation were fatally flawed. Okay. And that was something that the writers of the Constitution realized. Okay. So they rewrite it. They create the Constitution. There's a requirement before they go into effect that every state ratify it. Right? It had to have 100% ratification before it came into effect. It takes a little while, right? But the Constitution is ratified, and when it's ratified, okay, you end up with now who's going to be president of the United States, right? In the first election for the president of the United States, the unanimous decision, and this was unanimous, okay, was George Washington. Now, George Washington didn't say he wanted it. George Washington wasn't even there. George Washington was on his plantation when they rode up and told him that they had elected him president of the United States. George Washington and Martha Washington were a bit surprised. He discusses it with Martha, and there's an understanding that both of them had, right, with his wife, that he couldn't say no, right? She herself is not happy with this because she considers, that they are much too old now to be playing in politics. Okay. But at the same time, she says she recognizes the fact that this has to happen. This has to take place. He has to be the first president. And he becomes the first president. And they travel to New York. Right. Where Martha Washington sets up her little things, and she starts to institute certain dynamics, right, that become part of the first lady's roles and duties and everything, because both of them were uniquely aware that whatever they did was precedent setting. However they acted would become a precedent for people coming after them, right? And so their roles were quite restrained. And there were a number of crises, all right, that Washington had to basically resolve. One of which is called the Whiskey Rebellion, right? Where the legislature, right, enacts a 25% tax. Think of that. 25% tax out of nowhere, right, being applied to whiskey. Okay. Well, in Western Pennsylvania, they weren't happy. All right. And so they start up on a new idea of a revolution, right? So Washington goes, okay. He gets 10,000. He raises 10,000 troops, and they march into Western Pennsylvania and put it down. Washington part to the leaders of the rebellion, okay, because it's an exclamation point. Other things Washington does, okay, the British and the French are, of course, treating America like like crap. All right, you're not really a nation. You only exist because we allow you to exist. All right, there's not very much respect for America around the world, right? And Washington is keenly aware of this. And Washington is also, now you got to remember, Washington is the first president of the United States. So Washington gets to appoint all of SCOTUS, right? Now they have to be approved, right? But he names every member of the Supreme Court. And he chooses who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to be. Right? And the person he chooses as the first Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the first Supreme Court is John Jay. Okay. Now, he later on sends John Jay to Britain to negotiate a trade deal, because the British have basically embargoed all American trade. There's not going to be any trade with America, right? Well, yeah. Obviously, this isn't good. Okay, so he sends John Jay to London, and John Jay comes back 6 months after 6 months with a treaty. And when he comes back with the treaty, right, the first thing that happens is they basically accuse George Washington of being a traitor. Right, of giving in to British interests. All right, the French are doing are just as bad, right? Because the French, their ambassador that they've sent over is just created all sorts of havoc and basically has caused all sorts of other issues, right? To include the famous, like I was telling you about the time when the pitchforks to the torches, right, in front of his house where he's staying,
Yeah.
right, shows up. That's the French basically instigated it, right, in so forth.
If I may, just for a moment, I would just like to point out this yet again is proof you cannot trust the French.
Well, this is because all right, George Washington's first cabinet includes Secretary of the Treasury, his one of his aides, all right, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton becomes the first Treasurer of the United States. All right. For Secretary of State, he chose Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Now, Thomas Jefferson hates Alexander Hamilton, and Alexander Hamilton hates Thomas Jefferson. All right. In fact, various members of his cabinet, of George Washington's cabinet, all have a mutual antagonism toward one another. His cabinet meetings must have been absolute sheer hell. All right. And the worst part about it is George Washington has decided on a stance of neutrality between Britain and France, right? He doesn't want to get sucked into France, especially after the Revolution. After the French Revolution, with everything that's been going on, they're like, oh my God, they're being ruled by murdering thugs. Okay? So you don't want to side with the French. Okay? At the same time, you don't want to side with the British. We're just at war with them. Okay, we just fought a revolutionary war with them. They're not our friends. If you go back and say, yeah, let's side with the British, we might as well be a colony again. Okay? So the treaty comes back, and it's like a lot of treaties. You don't get a lot of what you want. Everybody's upset about it. But what it does do is it does loosen the export tariffs and everything on American goods, and it does allow for more trade. Trade with Britain, all right, trade throughout America increases by 50%, all right, throughout the United States. So, and it begins to open up. And what's more is the British were supposed to give up all of the southern forts along the Great Lakes, and they had failed to do that. There were still the British were still manning those forts. In fact, what you basically had was British forces on American territory up until the treaty. All right, so the British do relinquish that. So,
excuse me, American territory? Don't you mean recently conquered but yet still belong to us territory?
No, it was American territory. Leave, you freaking Canadian French lickers. So anyway, so there's that aspect of it. Okay, George Washington is the only president who was not first selected by a party. Right, so he's truly the first and only independent president of the United States we've ever had. Right. There are approximately 1 million. I can't explain how I want to hit you with a chair. Ow!
Says it all, doesn't it?
That's John Jay. John Jay was an interesting character. But the one big thing, the other thing that Washington had to fight through, of course, was who was John Jay? Didn't I just tell you? He was the Chief Justice of the United States. What's he doing as a diplomat? All right. He's the Supreme Court's supposed to be, neutral. Okay. So John Jay actually gives up his chair in the SCOTUS and so forth. But it shows you the different kind of crises that he has, right? That he goes through, that he has to manage as president of the United States. And then he does probably, which has been even Thomas Jefferson at the time acknowledged, right, was the one thing that no one had ever done when he came and said, "I will not stand." That was Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were quite the enemies. We'll talk when we talk about those guys. We'll talk about them a little bit more and their mutual antagonism toward one another. When it came up for the presidency again for a third term, George Washington said, "No, I will not stand for a third term, and if chosen, I will refuse." All right, selection as a third term. He wanted to retire from public life. He also wanted to set a precedent for American presidents that the most you would serve is 2 4-year terms, and then you would quit. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to do that, but George Washington did. And at the time, Thomas Jefferson even said that one single act, refusing to remain in power, okay, was what prevented the United States from becoming a dictatorship a la the French Revolution. That one fact, to say, okay, I will not do this. And even if you go back to when the Constitution was being, bantied about as they were talking about the revisions to the Articles of Confederation, there was a serious proposal that they came to Washington with and said and told him, they wanted you to be, they wanted him to become king. They wanted to choose him to become king of the United States, king. And he said, "Sirs, you're talking to someone about something that couldn't be more repugnant to him." Right? He absolutely said no. And that's the reason we don't have a king in the United States today, was because George Washington was offered the role of being king and said, not no, but go away.
From King George. Can you see a connection here somewhere?
Right. So it shows you the character of the man. Now, in a personal level, we were talking about his teeth earlier. People were talking about his teeth. All right. Now, back in the day, dental work and dentists, medicine in general. All right.
One thing before you continue. Don't start about the British and their teeth. Okay, just don't do it. Get it out of your head. Do not bother.
The dental work back in the day, right, was in its infancy. Right, people's teeth rotted for various reasons. All right, but not the least of which is, guess what? When they talk about impacted teeth and things like that, I hate to tell you guys, but that was normal back then. These things, you didn't have all this highfalutin crap that we have today. You didn't have x-rays, for example, all right? So that people understood why their teeth were not coming in. You did not have, when the only method of fixing a tooth back then was to pull it out, right? Now, George Washington. It's claimed that George Washington broke his teeth, right, by chewing, breaking using his teeth to break open Brazil nuts.
Okay. Walnuts, actually, I heard, but I'm not going to disagree with
Brazil nuts, walnuts, it's all the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. The reality is, trying to break nuts with your teeth, right? Back then, that's what people did. They did crap like that. right? But teeth hygiene, toothpaste were not something that was readily available to everybody. The diets were not as sugary as they were, so your teeth lasted longer, right? But by the same token, you didn't have ways of cleaning them like we do today, necessarily. So George Washington basically lost his teeth, not the least of which, believe it or not, they think that it had to do with some other types of remedies, to include being given mercury oxide, right, which probably didn't help a whole lot, giving him a little bit of mercury poison. It's amazing that, to be honest, that any of our leaders lasted as long as they did.
Yeah.
just because of the medicine of the day. But he didn't. The whole thing was George Washington's wooden teeth. Well, the dentures that he had were horribly fitted. Number one, he really hated having to wear dentures. Well, worse is they didn't fit well. They constantly caused him pain. But his dentures were not made out of wood. They were made out of hippo ivory and other human teeth. All right. Now, back in the day, that's just how they made these things. And there are people who will say, well, he made it from the teeth of his slaves. It's possible that some of the teeth that he had came from his slaves. All right. It's impossible to know, right? You'd have to do all sorts of genetic testing and try and go back and do all sorts of forensic analysis. But really, the teeth that they would get, right, would be pulled out of people after they died. Okay, you wouldn't pull a person's tooth unless there was a reason to pull it, right? So they're not going to go out there and grab a slave and go, okay, let me go grab this tooth and pull it out of there. Why would you do that? Right? No, but when a person dies, well, their teeth are just sitting there, grabbing a couple you might need, molar here and there, They're not going to complain about it. You're not going to pull a bad tooth and say, well, I'll take this bad tooth from this guy and stick it in your mouth. Why would you do that? Why do you want somebody's bad tooth in your mouth? Right? So that's the way teeth were. I mean, there were many people who had teeth. That was very common, that you would use teeth from the dead. Right? Whether they came from dead slaves or whether they came from slaves or not, who knows? Right? It's immaterial. Right? Now, George Washington, of course, eventually gets sick in his old age after he left presidency. He tries to retire back to Mount Vernon, to the joy of Martha. She was very pleased that George Washington was leaving and they could go back and they could settle down for once and just be a family back on Mount Vernon again. And it's while he's traveling to Mount Vernon, he goes out, all right, to actually survey some land that has been deeded to him in lieu of rent, back rent, right? And he gets sick. He gets cold. He has an inflammation in his throat. With today's medicine, would have been quickly taken care of. But back then, they basically the way it was put in the literature was they basically tortured him to death. They basically tried to burn it out of his throat, and of course, bloodletting was a thing. They figured that they probably let 40% of his blood out of his body, right? Mm-hmm. Right, and he died. I believe it was December 14th or December 15th in 1799. Right? So he didn't even make it to the next century. So. That is George Washington, and upon his death, he did free his slaves, but he could only free the slaves that he himself owned. He never owned the slaves that were part of the custos, part of the custos. Even though they were part of the household, they weren't slaves that he actually owned. All right, so therefore he couldn't release them, and unfortunately, because of the way that her inheritance was, neither could Martha. So ended the life of George Washington, still the most revered member of the Revolutionary War within the United States.
And if I may, just pointing out, he died the same way the Martians did in War of the Worlds. I wonder if that meant anything.
He was he wasn't hit with a ray that exploded his head.
No. The Martians in War of the Worlds were killed by the cold. What people don't actually understand was actually George Washington was a Martian. Confirmed.
Is that what we were going with this? Okay, I see now. An extraordinary man. There's only one man in history. Throughout history, you can look at all the different histories around the world. Right? There's only one other man in history that had in his hands the ultimate power and then walked away from it. Right? Within his nation. Right? That I've ever found in history that said, you know what? I've had enough of politics and I want nothing to do with it, and walked away. And that man is Scipio Africanus. Right? For those who don't know, it's the general who defeated Hannibal, right, at Zama, right, the Battle of Zama.
Yeah.
But if you look throughout history, right, having someone who's offered that kind of power and then walks away from it, it's not. It is almost completely unique in history. You don't see people like that. You don't see human beings designed that way. Right? It's not the way human beings were. Right? And yet, George Washington, he understood. Okay, he could see in the future what would happen with certain decisions. One of the things that he constantly wrote about, right, as president of the United States, one of his biggest concerns was what's going to happen to the nation over the issue of slavery. He realized early on that slavery was going to be a problem. Okay, he didn't find a solution for it. His only solution was he was hoping that other people would follow his lead and upon their death free slaves, and that slaves would eventually become free because everyone would basically free them upon their death. Right? That's what he was doing. That's where he was going. That's what he was hoping for. Of course, that isn't what happened. Right? But other things that he put in place, like I said, the fact that a president would serve just 2 terms and not go for a 4th. Or a 3rd, rather. That precedent, right, lasted until the 1930s, right? That lasted all the way for close to 200 years. That where they would not stand for a 3rd term, right? Lasted for over 100 years. Just that one precedent. It's an amazing achievement. And it really is. Right? And it wasn't until FDR, right, that was broken. Of course, it was his uncle that attempted to go for a 3rd term, which he was defeated in. But it was an amazing achievement, right? An amazing standard that got set, right? That for it to last that long, you know, to be that kind of an individual, and he like I said, he was very quiet. People say, well, you know, you never see him smiling in any portraits because he didn't smile. And the reason he didn't smile is he didn't want. His teeth caused him pain, right? His dentures caused him pain. Early on in his life, I'm sure he smiled quite a bit, but you know, it was just one of those things. You know, it's an amazing person at an amazing time with an amazing story who had an amazing life and lived in ways that set profound precedents and things, and did things that we ourselves can only look back, and if you try to put yourself in that position, you try to put yourself in that time frame, you can just marvel at, what it must have been like, what they were going through, how all this how all this came about. It was a magnificent achievement. They set about to revolt against the strongest empire in the world had ever seen, and had achieved independence, and then secured it. They didn't lose it, not for over 200 years. He really is. I mean, the father of the nation. So, anyway, that's everything I've got on George Washington right now. There are other anecdotes and stuff that I could probably relate, about the guy. I mean, he was a fascinating individual. He's someone that we really don't do enough of history for our founding fathers and who they were and how they were, so unique, right, and so forth. I mean, it was quite a time.
Without wanting to go too political, I've got to say that there are people out there that actually want to get rid of George Washington as a figure in America. Now, coming from a Brit, this may sound a bit unusual, but seriously, what the hell's going on, people? Okay, he may have been the bad guy at one point, but even we have respect for the man.
The George Washington, there's no nation without George Washington. One of the worst things we ever did, in my opinion, in modern times, right, was we used to celebrate George Washington's birthday. It used to be a federal holiday, and Abraham Lincoln's birthday was a federal holiday. And because they decided that they wanted to celebrate, right, because we decided we wanted to celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday, right, and give a holiday for Martin Luther King, they decided to stop celebrating George Washington's and Abraham Lincoln's birthdays, all right, and just consolidate it into a single day called President's Day. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes we've ever made in this country. I'm not saying that we shouldn't celebrate Martin Luther King Day, right? But we could have chosen a different day for Martin Luther King Day, to be honest. We could have chosen Martin Luther King Day during the summer, right? There was actually, in fact, I probably would have. If you want to know the truth of the matter, I would have made Martin Luther King Day the day of his speech. His I Have a Dream speech. That would have been when I had the day I think should be Martin Luther King Day, right? But that's just me. But the fact that we don't celebrate George Washington, the fact that people do not understand today, the younger generation today did not understand how much you owe, how much the world owes, right, to one simple guy who grew up under in an extraordinary world with extraordinary circumstances and lived an absolutely extraordinary life. I mean, it's with an extraordinary family, and yet it's somebody who himself, his own personality and so forth, his own arrogance and humility were things that we could not even fathom today. You take a look. There is no one in American politics today. No one in American politics today, right, that even comes close to the personality of George Washington, right? Of who he was, what he was like, right? There's no one. There's no one in American politics today, right? And there's no U.S. president ever like George Washington, right? None. You can point to ones that are like Thomas Jefferson. You can point to guys that were like, Andrew Jackson. You can point to the flash in the pans, right, of several presidents, right, variety-wise, right. But there's no one as unique, with the exception of probably Abraham Lincoln, right, as George Washington. And Abraham Lincoln was a unique individual that we'll talk about another time. But he lost more battles than he won, but he won his last battle. All right, during the Revolutionary War, he lost more battles than he won, far more battles than he won, but he won the last one. Now, and there's an interesting anecdote that tells you something else about the man. He was an extraordinarily loyal individual toward the people who served under him, and people never recognize this. Extraordinarily loyal and very mindful. Remember when I read that first article where he talks about his friends, right?
No.
He never forgot that in life, and I'll give you an example. During the surrender of the British at Yorktown, the first thing that people should know about in the surrender at Yorktown was Cornwallis couldn't bring himself to surrender. Right? He sent out one of his aides. Cheap move. All right. Not one of the British Empire's, shining moments. Okay.
Agree.
But his aide came out to turn the sword over. And the first thing he tried to do was he didn't want to surrender to the Americans. So instead of offering the sword to George Washington, he offered it to the French commander. The French commander told him no and pointed to George Washington. Okay. So the British commander, now chagrined, having to being forced to go to the George Washington to offer the sword of surrender. George Washington turned it down and told one of his aides, who was General Lee, who was one of the American commanders who was captured in Charleston when the British captured Charleston. All right, and it eventually been traded. You know how war trades go, right? When they trade prisoners of war, yeah. But they're traded as a prisoner of war. And so the actual sword of surrender did not go to Washington. It actually went to Lee. All right, and they surrendered it to Lee. Right, because George Washington had sent him down there, right, to try to prevent the British from taking over. But basically, there was no way that was not going to happen when Cornwallis arrived with overwhelming force. And the British, doing what they did normally, they did not treat Lee with any kind of real respect. All right, they really didn't. They treated Gage with more respect than they treated Lee, which is one of the reasons why George Washington, because he was a friend of George Washington never forgot the slight that they had given his friend, which is why he did it that way. Just I want to talk about that because it's one of the. It shows you who the commander was. It shows you who gives you a picture, an insight, right, into who George Washington was. He was loyal to his friends, very loyal. And it's one of the things that if I ever had to go back in history, if I ever had the ability to time travel, there's certain things that I would ask. And I would travel back to after the Revolutionary War. Right? And I would love to travel and talk to Benedict Arnold. Right? Because I would love to know what his thoughts were, okay, when he realized that George Washington hadn't forgotten him and was going to give him a major command, and that he had to turn it down because he was already too deep into the traitorous plot. and how he felt about that. Because it had to be extraordinarily regretful for him to realize that not that he had betrayed the nation, but that he had betrayed Washington. I wonder if he took that to his grave.
Fair.
You know, Benedict Arnold's an interesting individual. Okay.
I'm assuming we are planning on talking about him as well, even though he isn't one of the founding fathers, even if we only do a small bit on him.
Well, I think we need to do that. We also need to talk about the British commanders themselves. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
I don't think that for most Americans, they don't have a good understanding of the British commanders themselves. And I think we need to actually talk and do a little history lesson on each and every one of the British commanders, of the major commanders, right? And in that regard, I would also like to include Benedict Arnold, right? Because Benedict Arnold was a hell of a character, and in a lot of ways, he had the personality of Harry Morgan and Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys in that group, right? And but he had the upbringing. It was married to the upbringing of the aristocracy, you know, the genteel upbringing, right?
Yeah.
So you had a person who, quite frankly, highly intelligent, but Benedict Arnold, highly intelligent individual, right? Very much a fiery personality, right? And yet at the same time with that aristocratic mentality and overlay of the personality of the guy. He's quite an interesting individual. He never gets the accolades, right, in his life, all right, that he deserved. He really didn't.
Let's be honest, okay? To say that he is reviled amongst those that know who he is an understatement. Okay, I actually agree. He does deserve to at least get spoken about. Because, like it or not, okay, whether or not you consider the man absolute scum or not, at one point he was a very successful gentleman.
He would have been the hero, one of the big heroes of the American Revolution, if he hadn't turned traitors. So it happens with you know, when you start listening to the wrong woman.
I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I'm going to say it. Well, you know, there you go. Don't listen to women. And now, but for next week, what do you say we do the $100 bill, dude?
The $100 bill, dude? You want to do Franklin?
What,
you want to talk about Benjamin Franklin?
I mean, let's be honest. He's kind of important. If it wasn't for him coming over here and getting earache, pretty much this probably wouldn't have happened. Let's be honest.
If you want to do Benjamin Franklin next week, that's fine. That sounds good. I would.
Okay.
He is obviously in some ways he's probably more well known than George Washington, right?
Yeah.
As far as for a variety of reasons. Right? So he himself, however, was not. He is a revolutionary who never took to the field. He is not a battlefield commander in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. Is he a founding father? Yes. There's no doubt about that. Speaking of which, let's talk about founding fathers for a moment. right? Because I found this list.
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay, and we're going to talk about this list for a moment, if you don't mind. We'll share this screen here. This is from the people from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, and they have created a list of what they call the 12 founding fathers of the American Revolution. And of course, George Washington is on. I mean, they list him last here, but that's only because they presented this in alphabetical order. Okay, now I have no problem talking about anybody on this list. I personally don't. Right? You probably have heard most of these names, although some of the names are probably people that the average American probably doesn't know. For example, John Marshall. I think that very few Americans, right, in history class know who John Marshall was. George Mason. Okay. They know that there's such a thing as George Mason University from watching basketball, but that's probably all they know about George Mason. Okay. I'm not saying that they weren't important to the American Revolution. Okay. I am just going to point out. I'm just going to point out that they are not, all right, from an American standpoint, the 12 luminaries that they claim. All right. You are missing certain individuals here. Do you see Paul Revere on there?
No.
Do you see John Hancock on there?
This Mason guy is just to check, and yes, I realise I'm about to ask a stupid question. Is he the dude that made the jars? Mason jars. Oh, that laughter says no.
Is he the founder of Mason jars? I'll be honest with you. I don't know. I've never made that connection before.
It makes sense, though, doesn't it? For a person who knows nothing about people.
He may be. Most Americans, of course, are very, very, very aware of Alexander Hamilton. Very aware of Thomas Jefferson. All right. Very aware of Patrick Henry. Right. So I don't have a problem with that. Sam Adams. Most people think of Sam Adams. They think of beer. Right? I hate to say that, but it's true. John Adams, interesting individual. Also very much an absolute detractor of Thomas Jefferson. He actually begrudgingly, all right, John Adams was quite an individual. Very much a firebrand, right? But at the same time, very much someone who understood at times he had to put aside his own personality, and he would work with somebody toward a goal. All right, he would work with people that he didn't particularly care for toward a goal. All right, as long as the goal was for the American, to the betterment of America, he would put that aside quite quickly. His how do we put this? His disagreements. Let's leave it at that. with one Benjamin Franklin are also very well known. All right, him and Benjamin Franklin didn't like each other. Okay, but for them, it was pure personality. They understood, and both of them understood it. This is one of the most unique things about them. Right? They both understood that the reason they didn't like the other person was strictly because they had a personality clash. Personality-wise, they couldn't be further apart. Goal-wise, they were completely in sync. Personality-wise, they hated each other's guts because they couldn't stand the other person, right? Personality-wise. Their personalities were just, there are people that you will meet in life, all right? If you live long enough, folks, I'm telling you now, there are people you meet in life that you'll instantly hate and you'll never like them. And it has nothing to do with what they've done. It really will have nothing to do with anything that they've done that you can disagree with. It has everything to do with the fact that I just don't like that guy. I just don't like that girl. Right? Why? Because our personalities, for whatever reason, do not mesh. And they will have that same attitude towards you. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. There's just people that personality-wise, you will just not get along with. You can work with those people. And you can set aside those minor little differences because you understand it's a personality thing. But between John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, it was all about personality. They just, their personalities couldn't clash any harder. Right? John Adams was very much an upright individual. Upright and uptight. Okay? Mm-hmm. You want to talk about the original American prude, you're talking John Adams. If you want to talk about somebody who exemplifies the puritanic attitude, all right, of the American Northeast at the time, who could exemplify it, it was John Adams. That's you want to talk about America's puritanical type of upbringings, that's John Adams. But he wasn't just somebody who walked the walk. He's somebody who just talked the talk. He also walked the walk, and he had certain expectations for that. And but personality-wise, because of that uptight attitude, him and George, him and Benji were not the best of friends. Right? But yeah, Benjamin Franklin would be a good person to talk about.
Yeah, no problems. All right. In that case, thank you for coming out, ladies and gentlemen, and whatever the hell you want to call yourself. I don't care. We will be back next week about the same time. You're welcome to come along. Speak to you later. Bye-bye, everyone.
Good night, everybody.